Hey guys, welcome to the Truth Tank. Chris Donasso here. This week I'm going to be starting part 2 of a series I started last week on the resurrection of Jesus. And I guess the question that I'm really trying to answer is, can we believe the early reports? Can we believe the early testimony about the resurrection that we have in the Gospels? I think the answer to that question is yes. We'll see what you think. But I'm going to provide some evidence today for why I believe we can trust the Gospels. Before we start, I just want to talk to you about some common objections that you might hear about the Gospels. Number one is authorship. Critics will often say that because there's no names attached to the Gospels, that they're in some way unreliable. So if you were to open your Bible today to Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, it would say on the top, it would say the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to John. On the earliest documents or manuscripts that we have, those titles are not included. So it's likely that on the original documents, there was a name attached to those documents, but we don't have them in the earliest manuscripts that we have. So does this mean that they didn't write them? Well, not necessarily. What we do know for sure is that early history tells us that they were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. There is no competing testimony about this. All of the history that we have regarding those 4 books attributes those books to those authors. There's no competing voices on this. There's no other history or data or writings that say that they didn't write them. So the burden of proof is on the skeptic here. The second objection that you might hear is bias. And this is just the idea that because the Gospels were written by Christians, that they're some way invalid or untruthful or unreliable. Well, that's just not how we judge history. If slaves wrote about slavery, does that mean that it's just propaganda, that it's untruthful? Would we say that writings or testimony from the Jews about the Holocaust, just because they're Jewish, would that make it unhistorical or unreliable? Of course not. That's not really how you judge history. You have to look at the evidence. You have to look at the documents. You should determine whether it's true or not based on the strength of the argument. Another thing you might hear is contradictions. When you read the Gospels side by side, you're going to find some minor details that are different. You're going to find some things that seem to be discrepancies or inconsistencies in one gospel to the next. But I want to stress that these are minor details. These in no way take away anything from the essence of the gospel stories. These aren't major themes. These are minor peripheral details. For example, did Mary Magdalene go to the tomb that Sunday morning and find it empty, or was she accompanied by other women? Well, it depends what gospel you read. Jesus was crucified between 2 criminals. Did they both hurl insults at Jesus, or did one say, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom"? Or was Jesus crucified on the Passover, or did it happen after the Passover? Well, it depends on what gospel you read. What you want to remember about this is that these are differences, not necessarily contradictions. If you're old enough to remember 9/11, you probably remember exactly where you were, who you were with, and the approximate time of day when you first received that news. I can tell you my story. I was driving to work, and I turned on the radio. I heard about the first plane crashing into one of the buildings. As I was turning into my parking lot for work, at that exact moment, the second plane crashed into the other tower. I remember that very specifically. I remember walking up the steps to my office building, and when you first enter the building, the company Morgan Stanley was on the left, and their office had all glass walls. And so I could see in, and there was like 30 or 40 people huddled around a TV. They were watching the news as it was unfolding. I proceeded then down the hall to my office, and when I walked in, I went straight back to Carrie and Kelly, who were working. They had heard nothing about these events, and so I brought them up to speed. They were kind of preoccupied and busy. They really didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening. So that's my story. So let's suppose you were going to ask one of my coworkers what their perspective was on the events of 9/11. They might say that they remember Chris coming into the office, And then they might say I went back to my desk and I talked to Juanita and I talked to Nicole about what was happening. We couldn't believe it. I remember leaving the office that morning to go to the restroom, and on my right was Morgan Stanley, and there was a bunch of people huddled around a TV or a computer. So now you have two reports about one event and varying details. One report says that Morgan Stanley was on the left. The other report says that Morgan Stanley was on the right. One report says that Kelly and Carrie were present. Another report says that Juanita and Nicole were present. Both stories are true. They're just given from a different perspective. So just because you have varying details about the same event, that doesn't make the reports untrue or untrustworthy. So anyway, those are some of the common objections that you might hear about the Gospels. But let's look at the Gospels. Let's evaluate them. I really love the work Mike Licona has done on this. He is a New Testament scholar, PhD, brilliant guy. He's one of the leading voices on the resurrection of Jesus. You can check out his website. I'll put a link below, and you can check out some of the resources that he has. It's really great stuff. But basically, he likens the data that we have, or the sources that we have, to like playing cards. It goes something like this. You're dealt a hand. Some cards are better than others. Sometimes you wish you had more cards or a stronger hand, but ultimately the hand that you're dealt is the hand that you have to play. So let's look at the Gospels and let's kind of evaluate them, and let's value them the same way we value cards. So if we look at Mark, or also known as John Mark, it was written in 70 AD. John was not an eyewitness, but we know that he received his information from Peter, who was not only an eyewitness, but was kind of part of the inner circle of Jesus. He was one of the closest disciples of Jesus. So this is a pretty good source, right? It's not necessarily an ace. It's not an eyewitness, so it's not a king. But we could probably at least say that it's a queen, right? Pretty good. Well, how about Matthew? Matthew was also known as Levi. Matthew was a tax collector, so he worked for Rome. He probably had very good reading and writing skills. He was, in fact, an eyewitness. Matthew was written, scholars say, in about 80 AD. Matthew likely had scribal training. So Matthew's pretty good, right? This is coming from an eyewitness, and so this is a pretty good source. So let's call this a king. All right, what about Luke? Luke also wrote the book of Acts. Luke was not an eyewitness, but we do know that he either received his information from an eyewitness or someone who knew an eyewitness. In fact, it's possible that Luke was a companion of Paul. There's some good evidence to suggest that. So this is a pretty decent source, right? Worst case scenario is Luke would be a jack. Best case scenario is we'll give Luke a queen status. But let's be conservative. Let's just say it's a jack. All right, next we have the Gospel of John. John was often referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was also, like Peter, part of that very inner circle of Jesus, one of the closest disciples. He was an eyewitness. He also wrote John 1, 2, and 3. It's also believed that he probably wrote Revelation. So again, another really strong source, an eyewitness. This is pretty good. So I think we can say that John's a king as well. So let's look at the hand that we have. We've got two kings, a queen, and a jack. This isn't such a bad hand in my opinion. I think we have a pretty good hand here. But what if we had an even better card? What if we had an ace? What if we had something that kind of trumps this whole hand? Well, guess what? We do. This is some of the strongest evidence that we have. And not only are the writings early, but some of the things believed by even critical scholars to date right back to the cross. So be sure to join me next week. This was kind of a short video. Like I said, I just wanted to go a little deeper into kind of the historicity of the Gospels. But we're going to move away from the Gospels next week. This is good stuff, strong evidence. Be sure to join me, and we'll see you there. Thanks a lot.